Good evening. It's good to be here. Anthony's walking off, and I've got a joke for him. I don't know if you meant to do the John, kneel at the cross combo, but I've been waiting for that since John and Beverly placed membership here. John, kneel at the cross. Isn't that wonderful? And he does. He absolutely does. I meant to mention this morning, and people always ask me, hey, can you announce this? Can you announce this? I had my own announcement, and I couldn't remember to do it, but I'm going to have to do it tonight. In a couple of weeks, Scott and I are going to be taking, oh yeah, Scott, you're out, aren't you? We're taking the youth group boys camping, and we're going to video Scott camping, and so that's going to be the highlight film. But we do want to invite all the teen boys and their dads. If you want to come, man, we want you to come. It's going to be June 14th and the 15th. And just a couple of things that I need. One, I need a bear-resistant cooler. If any of you have a bear, like a Yeti, one that closes and, seals off, one of those high-dollar ones that most preachers can't afford. But if you happen to have one, maybe you want it as a door prize somewhere or something like that, I could really use that because big enough for Scott to get in. I don't know. So here's the deal. I mean, obviously, probably not even going to see a bear. But if a bear can smell your food, it'll come. And so we want to seal it off where it can't smell our food. Hide it in the van. Julie said, I don't want it in the van because it'll attack the van then. I don't know. We'll figure something out on all that. But if you happen to have one that you would allow us to take camping, that would be wonderful. And then, of course, if some of you dads want to come with your sons, we would love to have you as well. It'll be a good time. What we'll do is we'll leave the building here about noon or 1 o'clock on that Thursday. It's a Thursday to Friday because we're trying to be out there when it's not packed with other people. And so we're going to go out kind of northwest of Boulder a little bit, out near Jamestown, if any of you have ever been up in that area. There's a trailhead called Sarin St. Verain's Trailhead, that's where we're going to be camping. It's just about a quarter mile from the car. We'll be setting up tent and having a fire, and I'll cook some burgers or hot dogs for that evening, and then we'll do a campfire breakfast in the morning, and you can do fish and things like that. So it should be a lot of fun, and the boys, I think, are somewhat excited about it, most of them anyway. Some of the men may not be quite as excited. I told Scott I have a cot for him, and so any other luxuries you might want to lend to Scott to make it a little easier on him, I'm sure he would appreciate. But anyway, if you have any questions, you can come talk to me afterwards. If you have a cooler that you're willing to donate, definitely come talk to me so that I can make sure we have that ahead of time. It was several years ago, I walked into a friend of mine's house. He was a member of the church there in Leonard where I was preaching at the time, and his wife sold insurance out of the house, and so she had different workers at different times working for her. In fact, Julie at one time answered phone for us. But this particular time that I went in was fairly early in our relationship, and they had a young lady named Rachel was working for him, and he and his wife introduced me to Rachel. Hey, this is our preacher and all that, and we talked a little bit about the church, and she said, well, the Church of Christ, you're the ones that sing acapella, right? And I said, we are, yes. And she said, I just learned what acapella meant. And I said, really? And she said, yes, it means out of the church. Now, a lot of you may not know that, but the term or the phrase acapella is an Italian term, which today means singing without instruments. But what's interesting is, originally, the Italian phrase meant out of the church. And so when they saw someone sitting on the street corner and singing, they might say, look, that is music out of the church. It became so connected and identified with the church to sing without instruments that what we know today as a cappella music was exactly that. It was music that was literally out of the church. Now, there's a significance to that I want to talk about tonight. It's a significance that tells us a little bit about the church and its history. The Italian phrase appears in writing around the 3rd century AD. And so the church had been around for a couple of hundred years at that point. And by that point, everyone looked at that music as music that was out of the church. But what it teaches to me, or what it gives me an idea of, is it tells us about the church's visibility, the church's practices, and the church's music. And we're going to look at those 3 ideas. The first one is the visibility of the church. If you've ever read much about the church and about history of Christianity and things like that, you're going to come across something that is quite a spurious story in itself. And I mentioned something about it in our bulletin this morning, but it's the idea of the Jesus fish. W.E. Vines, for example, in the 11th edition of his particular expository dictionary of New Testament words, the hardback cover of it anyway, they include in there a story about the tradition of the Jesus fish. Christianity Today, which is a very popular Christian magazine in the denominational world, had an article recently about the Jesus fish. And the tradition goes that the many cultures at that time used the symbol of the fish for different things. Pagan cultures, for example, used the symbol of the fish for fertility. But the Christians, somewhere around the second half of the 1st century, began to adopt the Jesus fish symbol, which, if you know what I'm talking about, it has the 2 arcs that intersect and make it look like a very simplified fish. That symbol today represents Christianity, but it has, in their mind, since the middle of the 1st century or so. And what happened was the word fish, ichthus, which is the Greek word for fish, made an acrostic for Jesus Christ, God, Son, Savior. And that the Christians adopted this symbol as a secret symbol. So like if you were traveling down the road, the tradition says that if you were a Christian and you met a stranger on the way, you could draw an arc in the sand. And if the other person came and drew the opposing arc and made the fish, you knew you were in great company. If you were looking for a place to meet, you might walk through town, and there were secret meeting places in each town, and they would have the fish above the door, and you would know that that's where Christians met. They didn't have the sign that said Church of Christ meets here. They simply had the fish above the door. In the early years, because the cross was such an obvious symbol of Christianity, it brought persecution on the church. And so in tombs, they would mark tombs with the fish so that people would know. The problem is that there's no history really that goes that far back that says that Christians were using the Jesus fish. In fact, the fish symbol associated with Christianity, while it sounds good, Jesus fed 5,000 with fish. Jesus said, I will make you fishers of men. It just seems to go hand in hand with Christianity, but it's quite a late appearance, really. Because here's the fact. The fact is, the Christians didn't meet in secret. They met very openly. That's exactly what Jesus told them to do. The commission was that they were to go into all the world, preaching. Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 and 19. It's hard to do if you're secluded in some hideout that is secret that no one knows except for the initiated. In fact, not only was the preaching supposed to go out far and wide, but Christianity was persecuted in the very early days. In Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, said that the church was scattered abroad because of persecution. Doesn't sound like people didn't know where they were. Doesn't sound like the Jews didn't know where they were. They persecuted them. Later, when the Romans are persecuting the church, it sounds like the Roman government knows where they are. Why? Because Christians weren't meeting in secret. Paul was commissioned, remember, to go and drag church members from their home and bring them before the council in Acts chapter 9 and verse 1. The fact is our message is just too important to be hidden. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says that we are the light of the world. No man lights a lamp and puts it under a bushel basket. He puts it on a lampstand that all the world may see. Christianity was supposed to be, designed to be, a visible religion, despite the Jesus fish tradition. But think about the term acapella, out of the church. Doesn't that suggest to us that the church was visible in the first and second and third century? So visible that people that weren't even initiated into the community of believers knew that that was music that came right out of the chapel. They knew it. Why? Because it was distinctive. That fact that an entire style of music is named after the church shows the church's visibility. And what does that say to us? Well, today the Jesus fish is very popular, right? People stick it on the back of their trunk of their car. People wear it on jewelry. People have it on signs and posters in their homes. It seems that it's everywhere. And people think, well, this is how I show I'm a Christian. Now, look, if you've got a Jesus fish, I'm not going to say that you're in sin or anything like that, but understand that our visibility as Christians must go much further than wearing a fish. It must be seen in our deeds. It must be seen in the words which we share with our friends and our neighbors and our coworkers as we tell them of the love of God, as we speak of the relationship that we personally have with the Creator. See, when we are doing that, we are visible as the church. How sad it is, and I've done this on several occasions where I maybe was speaking at a new place. I've never been there before. I drive into town, I'm not sure exactly where the church is, and you go in and you ask the guy at the convenience store, hey, do you know where the Church of Christ is? I don't think we have a Church of Christ in this town. Well, you better, because I'm supposed to be speaking there in 20 minutes. Help me out. It's strange how often the church is not visible. Not just about the building being able to be seen, but the works of the church, more importantly, being seen by a community. So that when someone mentions Brighton Church of Christ, people can say, hey, I know what you're talking about. We get all that from the phrase acapella? Sure, why not? Not only is it about the church's visibility, it's about the church's practice. The new religion had new practices that were distinct from anything else that had come before. The worship of the church was different from the Roman pagans that worshiped what we refer to as Roman mythology today. It was different than the Eastern religions that existed in a contemporary plane as Christianity of the first century. It was different than Judaism. It was much different than Judaism. You think about in the Jews' religion, one of the central ideas was animal sacrifice. But the Hebrew writer tells us that offering those sacrifices year by year did not make the comers perfect. So what did Jesus do? Jesus entered once and for all, Hebrews chapter 9. He is our sacrifice, our permanent and eternal sacrifice, a sacrifice that needs never to be repeated. Christian worship was different, distinct from Jewish worship in a lot of different ways. One of them was by the use of instruments. The Jews were known to have used instruments in their worship, introduced by David, but still used. And yet, Acapella says the church in the first centuries did not use instrumental music. It was distinct from Judaism in that way. It was different. Judaizers, remember, they came in to spy out their liberties, which the Christians had in Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. They wanted to see, how do these people worship? What's different? How have things changed? That's all they wanted to know. And so they're coming in to see, what are they doing? They're not using instruments. They're not sacrificing animals. They're not washing their hands. They're not burning incense. That's why it was such a radical religion. Radical, I think we've mentioned before, means at the very root. It wasn't just grafting on to Judaism some new sprig, but it was radical from the very root, stem, and leaf. It was a new religion. It was God's new religion. In fact, in Galatians, in chapter 1, as Paul is setting up that entire account that is going to take place, he says, you know how I used to be in my father's religion, the Jews' religion, not God's religion anymore, because things had changed. These Christians, because of their change, were accused of sedition against the Roman government. They were accused of cannibalism because they ate the Lord's body and drank his blood. The visibility of the church, the practices of the church, show that it was well known far and wide. And some in the church today dislike that distinctiveness of the church. In recent years, it seems more and more congregations are leaving the pattern of the New Testament. What is authorized? Questioning, for example, the use of instrumental music. 10 years ago, the Christian Chronicle took out an ad, full-page ad signed by young preachers in the Brotherhood that still affirmed that instrumental music in conjunction with the worship of the church was sinful. Why did they even need to take that ad out? Well, because so many were giving up. There's a lot of people that use code language, things like, I'm fine with our acapella traditions. What that means is, I'm not a sound Bible teacher. Don't listen to another word I say. Now, what that means is that they are ready to change things. We're okay with the tradition, but we have no problem with the instrumental music. They don't even have to add the second part. I know what they're going to. And so does God. Why? Because they're uncomfortable with the distinctive nature of the church. And so they start to blur the lines of fellowship between the church and other religions. And as they blur those lines, well, it's easier for us to step over the line because we didn't quite see it anymore. And what's interesting to me are these churches that go to, churches of Christ, mind you, that go to big bands. It wasn't too many years ago, the North Richland Hills Church in Fort Worth, and a guy named Rick Atchley was the preacher there, and he did his entire series on both and. And you know, we can have both instrumental and a cappella music. It was both and. It's not an either or, it's a both and. That's the way God intended it to be. And shortly after that, he had a sermon posted on the internet. One of these days, maybe I'll show it to you. But it's the title of the sermon is The Party God. The Party God. And so what he does is at the end of his lesson, they have these buckets full of the blowout party favors. You know those? Everyone got one. And we're going to blow the party favors to celebrate God during the invitation song. And we've invited our 8th graders who have been learning a new song to come up and demonstrate the party atmosphere. And so they came up and they're singing a song. The band strikes up with piano and drums and guitar and bass. And the 8th graders are up there cutting a rug like you can't imagine. And everyone in the audience is blowing their party favors. And God was weeping. The thing is if you want the big band experience, why come to the Church of Christ, who just started doing it a few years ago? Go somewhere else where they're good at it. Go somewhere else where they've been doing it for decades. And they have professional musicians And if you're going to, isn't that the mentality that Amos gave in Amos chapter 4? When he said, won't you come to Gilgal and transgress? Come to Bethel and multiply your transgressions. In other words, what Amos is saying is if you're not going to follow God, go do whatever you want. Don't worry about going to Jerusalem. Go to Bethel or to Gilgal. One place is as good as another if you're not going to follow the truth. Well, the same is true here. And so the redesign of the worship patterns to follow sectarianism, to me, it just doesn't make sense to try to change the church in that way, to ignore God's boundaries or God's authority. The book of Ephesians is often used in the discussion of instrumental music. I like to use Ephesians 5, verse 10. Well, not verse 19, that's where most people go. Because when people start talking about instruments, they say, well, what's wrong with instrumental music? What's wrong with it? But read, that's not even the question to ask, is it? According to Ephesians 5 and verse 10, he says we are to prove what is acceptable to God. The real question is, what's right with it? You want to add instrumental music? What's right with it? Where is it authorized? We simply don't see in the New Testament anywhere where it's authorized as part of the church's worship. And so we must continue to follow the same distinctive patterns and practices of the New Testament church. These were the paths, or footsteps, which were set out for us to walk in. 1 Peter 2 and verse 21. And then finally, we think about acapella. Not only does acapella, the phrase, speak to the visibility of the church and the practices of the church, it speaks directly to the music of the church. The overt mark of Christ's church in the first century was no instruments, just singing. So much so that our tradition of a cappella music comes right out of the chapel, out of the church. There were no instruments. When I took my first preaching job, I went to Granite, Oklahoma. Granite, Oklahoma had, well, they call them granite mountains, but they're not really mountains. But they are large granite boulders, and there were 5 different quarries in granite, which were mining granite. They're one of the largest suppliers of red-colored tombstones from Granite, Oklahoma. And first thing I want to do is go to the quarry, see what they're doing. How are they making these tombstones and these markers and things like that? So I get there, and the guy that owned the quarry was a Methodist. And, he's poking fun at me, about not having a piano. He said, hey, we just bought a brand new organ. You can have our old one, and all stuff like this. See? But here's the deal. The lack of instrumental music is not about preferences. It's not about our preference. It's not like Christians woke up one day and said, you know what, I prefer no instruments. I did a wedding years ago, and they had a cappella singers at the wedding, but they were the singers themselves were a family that attended a denomination, and he was the main song leader. And I remember him saying to me, he said, sometimes when I'm leading singing, I'll have them stop playing the music because I prefer the sound of the church singing a cappella. Well, whoop-de-doo. It's not a preference thing, though. It's not about what you prefer. It's about what God authorized. It is not a matter of tradition, as people say, well, that's the Stone Campbell tradition. Well, you have to go a little further back. That's the Jesus Paul tradition. That's the first century church. Okay? And the idea is these are the kinds of tradition Paul was talking about in 2 Thessalonians 3 when he said, "Mark those that walk not according to the traditions which they have received from us." The teaching in the church which was passed down by the apostles. It's not about tradition. It's not about preference. It's not about economy. Some people think, well, the Church of Christ doesn't have instruments because it can't afford them. I don't need the Methodist old organ, even if they gave it to me. It's not a matter of economy. It's simply a matter of authority. Brother Tom Bright used to say, "Where's the authority?" Where's the authority for that? Early church was acapella. It was without instruments. The distinction was about the instruments. When people heard those words, they weren't saying, "Oh, well, those are the kinds of words that come out of the church. That's why that music was a cappella." No, it was because there was no instrument with that music. That's what made them think that it was out of the church. And that very practice spawned the term a cappella. Even the unchurched recognized it. A cappella. It described the music of the church. I think it's an interesting term, a cappella. Maybe that's something you hadn't heard about, that it means out of or in the manner of the church. But it does tell us a lot about the history of the church and its music, doesn't it? That the world recognized that music without instruments, music that plucked the strings of the heart, music that was used with a natural instrument of the voice which God himself created, so characterized the church that people in the 1st century, in the 2nd century, in the 3rd century, in the 4th century recognized it as music straight out of the church. Tonight, maybe there's someone here who's been thinking about these issues. Look, we need to think about these issues. With every generation, we need to go back and restudy. With every year, we should spend time doing exactly what the Bible says. All Scripture is inspired of God and is profitable for doctrine and for reproof. The prefix "re" means what? Again and again and again. And the word "proof," to prove it again and again and again and again. Don't be ashamed to ask the questions. Don't make people feel ashamed because they've asked the questions. But use the word for what it's for reproving what we already believe to be right, the direction that we're going, but to make sure that we continue on the path of the 1st century church. If tonight you need to come to confess sin, or maybe you need to obey the gospel, all things are ready for you, just as they would have been ready in the 1st century. You too can become a 1st century Christian, just a Christian, if you'll come while we stand and while we sing.